Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Elaine Hsieh Chou in support of Disorientation and in conversation this evening with Ryan Lee Wong. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be sharing links to purchase Disorientation from Literati throughout the event. You can interact with us at any time using the Q&A feature of the webinar that's available on your toolbar, where you will also find the CC icon if you need live transcription this evening. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, you will always find links to purchase books in the description directly below me, where you can also like and subscribe to our videos to be kept up to date with all of our at-home with Literati events when they become available on our channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, of course, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. But most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I will introduce tonight's author and our interlocutor. Elaine Hsieh Chou is a Taiwanese-American writer from California, a 2017 Rona Jaffe Foundation Graduate Fellow at NYU, and a 2021 NYSCA NYFA Artist Fellow. Her short fiction appears in Black Warrior Review, Guernica, Tin House Online, and Plowshares. Disorientation is her first novel. Speaking with her this evening, Ryan Lee Wong is the author of the forthcoming novel, Which Side Are You On?, which will be released by Catapult in October of this year. Previously, he served as program director for the Asian American Writers Workshop and managing director of Kundiman. He's organized exhibitions and written extensively on the Asian American movements of the 1970s. He holds an MFA in fiction from Rutgers. He recently lived for 2 years at Ancestral Heart Zen Monastery in Millerton, New York. Please join me in welcoming Elaine Hsieh Chou and Ryan Lee Wong into your living rooms.
Hello. Okay, is it us now? Yes. Okay. Ryan, you can hear me. I'm coming in clear.
Sounds great.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Literati Bookstore and John. Thank you, Ryan, for being here with me. And of course, thank you to everyone joining us virtually in this virtual space. I'm going to read for a little bit. So all you need to know for this passage is that Ingrid Yang, the protagonist of the novel, has a white fiance who she has recently discovered has 3 Asian ex-girlfriends. Waiting at a stoplight, Ingrid was needled by the realization that she was avoiding Stephen. She had never, in all 5 years, ignored his calls. But what was she supposed to say to him? Hello, dear. How's the weather over there? And do you even love me for who I am? Naturally, he knew she was upset, but he attributed it to their combative video chat. He had texted he was sorry. She had drafted a dozen replies before deleting them all. On the one hand, her self-induced panic attack over his 3 Asian ex-girlfriends was ludicrous. Was it fair to bring charges against him for his past relationships? And was his offense, if it could even be called that, serious enough to warrant a breakup? After all, she loved Stephen. She counted on him tremendously. His actions and words had an overwhelming effect on her. Their lives and possessions and habits were inextricably enmeshed. And she felt an intense attachment to him, like she was a non-cancerous growth on his thigh. That was love, wasn't it? Ingrid was physically incapable of picturing the future without also picturing the future of Mr. and Mrs. Green. They would marry, get pre-approved for a mortgage, retire, grow old, die in their sleep, ideally at the exact same time. Like Judith Newman and her husband, they would constitute the quintessential academic couple. A literary translator and a professor, their personalities, bookish, nitpicky, socially awkward, one and the same. Quiet nights at home spent completing a 3D clown puzzle or enjoying a documentary on the feral behavior of cats. On the behavior of feral cats. Theirs was a foolproof blueprint for happiness. Ingrid had coveted this future for the 2 of them, had waited impatiently for it. And now, because of some old photos, she was willing to toss it all out the window? Eunice's words rang in her head. Are you insane? And yet she couldn't expel Alex's declaration from her head either. The sad thing is, Ingrid, you'll never know for sure. How could she know for sure? Like Eunice had explained, something as superficial as taste in food and pop culture was meaningless. This sort of man was becoming craftier. He knew better than to showcase his collection of samurai swords on his bedroom wall or advertise his encyclopedic knowledge of 1990s anime on the first date. Like all mammalian predators, he had adapted to his environment. This sort of man could be anywhere. Ingrid glared suspiciously at the white men passing by on the sidewalk. Should she put Stephen through a series of tests? Attach him to a polygraph machine while thumbing through photos of women from every conceivable ethnicity, taking note of who made his heart rate quicken? Make him sign a binding legal document prohibiting him from dating another Asian woman should they ever break up, in order to save her the humiliation of being relegated to number 4 on the list. Persuade him to relocate to a country with so few Asians, the odds of him straying from her would be next to none. Poland? North Dakota? Because ever since the 3 Asian ex-girlfriends incident, Ingrid had begun eyeing her fellow Asian woman in an unsettling new way. Here was another one, traipsing down the street while listening to music on earbuds. Ingrid glowered at her, even bared her teeth a little. A month ago, she would have been an unremarkable pedestrian. Today, she was a direct threat to her impending marriage. All her life, Ingrid had dutifully held up white women as the embodiment of beauty, and it follows had compared herself to them, and it follows had come up short. The white woman's elevated position in her hierarchy of beauty had now been unseated. After all, if Stephen had a F word for Asian women, then every single one alive on the planet between the ages of 18 and, say, 62 must be irresistible to him, since race was the defining pool of attraction. She didn't think individual attractiveness had played a major role, since Annie was dowdy and Jenny was plain, and Sandra, Ingrid hated to admit, was more conventionally attractive than herself. But then, what was the deciding factor between more than one Asian woman? Was the only way to avoid replacement by another Asian woman to somehow become the ultimate Asian woman? Ingrid froze in the middle of the street. So why had Stephen chosen her? Because she happened to be in the right place at the right time? If he'd met another Asian woman 5 years ago with roughly her same age, education, and prospects, would he have ended up with her? Would he be just as happy? Her thoughts were interrupted by her buzzing phone. Eunice had texted her. A new U season finale just started. Want to come over? Oh no, Eunice was an Asian woman too. Though this was an obvious fact, the knowledge drizzled over her as if for the first time. She frantically flipped through a mental catalog of all the times Stephen and Eunice had been in the same room. Did he ever hug her for a second too long? Did his eyes lustily glaze over at the sight of her cherubically round face? An unsettling impulse came over her, like she wanted to shove Eunice off a swing set. Was she jealous of her? She had never compared herself to her closest friend in that capacity, as if they were 2 straight female primates tussling over the last straight male primate. She had always protected their friendship from such base instincts. What was wrong with her? For fuck's sake, Ingrid cried aloud. She charged into an ice cream shop and reemerged with 2 cones, groaning unhappily as she looked away at both, then stormed up the street towards Whittlebury Park. Passerby dodged out of the way, aware this woman was not to be crossed. But Eunice had debunked her brother's theory. According to her, the reason why a couple started dating didn't matter. What mattered was why they stayed together, in which case Stephen had to love her for who she was. He wouldn't date someone for 5 years and propose to her simply because of her ethnicity, would he? And yet, all those times he'd commented on how cute and small Ingrid was, on how she was his ideal partner, on how he loved her hair, eyes, and skin. What had he been saying, really saying? That if she didn't have her hair, eyes, and skin, he wouldn't love her? And the fact that he cycled through 3 Asian women in a row. Was he trying to upgrade on the standard model each time? The sad thing is, Ingrid, you'll never know for sure. He was hopeless. If she chose to stay with him, she'd go insane testing him 24/7, trying to figure out definitively and without a doubt that he loved her, not because of what she looked like or what she represented, but because of the part of herself that was incorporeal. Thank you. Thanks, Ryan.
I'm sure people are clapping at home too. Thank you for that, Elaine. Thank you all for being here. I'm really, really happy to get to celebrate this book, Disorientation. It's one of a kind, and I'm really excited to get to ask all my questions. So, I mean, first, it was a pleasure hearing you read. I think something that strikes me right now about listening to you is how discursive the book is. You know, so much of the book is, it's told in a close third person. So it's not, you know, Ingrid's perspective, first person, but so much of the book is about Ingrid's thoughts and Ingrid's processing. And she has a very high capacity, for better and worse, to rationalize things. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about developing her voice and her character, and how you landed on this way of telling her story.
Oh, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, this is a great question because I think it was a struggle, and I think it was hard to find that balance between, you know, presenting a character who is very clueless, but that we can sort of hopefully, you know, lightly mock, but to treat her with great, you know, love and heart and empathy. And that was really important to me. So I think it is strange that, you know, I don't even know the how it worked out, but I think I just sort of decided to do both. It was like we can, you know, lovingly mock her and sort of be able to see her actions and sort of how, like you say, she rationalizes things that are just like abusive or racist. And at the same time, I wanted to be able to like dip in and out where we're just completely in her head. So I didn't know for a long time. I was like, is this even working? Is this, am I allowed to do this? But I just sort of try to follow my instincts and juggle both. But yeah, so I wrote 3 versions of the novel, and the second version was in the first person. So I think I needed to write that version to really get in Ingrid's head. But then I unfortunately learned, you know, afterwards, like, oh, it really doesn't work in the first person because there's no distance between, you know, how we see her. And then for her to sort of come off as clueless, since it was all coming from herself, it was, you know, she just didn't seem very bright, like, and she is a PhD student, you know, so it didn't click. But it was a struggle. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the way you describe it is the way I felt, which is I started reading and I was kind of like concerned. I was like, oh no, I really hope Ingrid gets it together here, because her life is, you know, just not, she's not living her best life in the beginning. And so this to me is actually, this is the reason to pick up this book for everyone at home. I've never read a novel like this that is about an Asian person in general, and specifically an Asian woman's politicization, in terms of, I guess, especially what we would call maybe radical politics or racial politics. And I think that's an incredibly bold thing to try to write, because many of the people who get to the point of like understanding racial politics want to pretend it was never any other way. Like, I always got this, I was always woke. I never want to look back on a time when I wasn't. And that's exactly what this book is. It's going through the really grueling process of coming into racial awareness. So how did you know this was what you were going to write about, someone's racial awakening?
That was beautiful. Wow. I'm truly honored to be read that way and understood that way. And I think you're totally right. I think there's an instinct to want to protect ourselves constantly from, you know, quote unquote being canceled, and that, you know, I was always the way I am. I understood everything from the start. And yeah, I think, but it's not interesting, right? And it's not funny. I think reading that type of narrator who's like, I know everything is yeah, it's hard to stay in that mindset, because it's just doesn't seem, it's like a shield or a performance, right? And to me, it was important to write this character who I think in order to make certain points, it was like we had to discover them, or not we, but like she had to discover them, as the story went on. And it was important to me because it was something I went through, in 2014, where I just didn't know about so many things in the world where even though I identified as a liberal, I voted Democrat my whole life. It was this very moderate, safe sort of just you cling on to like I'm a good person because I'm on the right side, and then the questioning stops, the education stops, the reading stops. And it wasn't until 2014 when Ferguson was happening and I got into protesting and was meeting activists who dedicated their life to this that I did feel so clueless and honestly a lot of times just afraid of like opening my mouth because I was like, oh God, there's so much I know how to say. And I try to capture Ingrid's anxiety of just like I don't know how to move in this world. Yeah, and that was all very personal to me. And I really had to unlearn a lot, and I really had to reckon with like, oh, how have I been complicit? Not just like, oh, read some new books and call it a day, but really reflect back on my life, things that I said, things that I'd let slide. That's really it's painful, right? And I think Ingrid, when she starts to think about her past and stuff, it's like, yeah, that's really painful that she did those things. And to me, it's still painful for me when I think about, especially when I was very young and so much of this understanding and knowledge was not available to me. I try to be generous with like young Elaine, but a lot of times, like, yeah, I just want to like hide under the covers. Like, no, I didn't do that. Right. Please tell me.
Yeah, I think it's the hardest thing in the world. It feels like being skinned.
Yeah.
So speaking of, wanting to be that perfect radical person, there's another character in the book named Vivian, who is a brilliant PhD student, kind of Ingrid's competitor, arch nemesis. Later, the relationship changes in a really interesting way. But I was really fascinated by that character because there were definitely Vivians for me as I came into my political awakening, people I was really intimidated by, people who I also learned from, people who sometimes shut me down in ways that were not so skillful sometimes. So yeah, I'm interested in what it was like to write Vivian, and also to write the way she changes and the relationship changes.
Yeah. Oh, Vivian. Yeah, I do love her. And she was tricky, not only because she is Vietnamese, she's Southeast Asian. And I, had to ask, like, can I write this character? But to me, it was so clear that she would not be East Asian. Just because I think when I was unlearning a lot of stuff, like a lot of it was East Asian privilege and light skinned each, like I was just like, oh, what, I didn't know. Okay, I didn't know that I had all this. And then when I started thinking about it, it was all very true. So there is that trickiness. And well, this is interesting. In the second version, Vivian's character is incarnated by someone named Jeremy Nguyen, who is sort of the early Alex as well, in that he's like hot and Ingrid feels very flustered by him. But it seemed a little too pat that it's like, he's a nemesis that she like falls for and everything. But with Jeremy's character, I was so nervous about writing him that virtually I just like left him alone. It was like everyone got that satirical, sort of pen or lens on them, right? Like they would be written in that way where the narrator is able to mock them. But whenever it came to Germany, I was like, oh, nope, because, I, in a lot of ways, like agree with his politics. So I think I was worried that the reader would be like, oh, if Elaine feels that there's humor to be found here, then she's saying these arguments or these beliefs are not legitimate. And that's absolutely not what I'm saying. I think it's just ultimately in a sort of comic satirical novel, like everyone needs to be subjected to that voice, or, because otherwise it read as very obvious, like the author is just afraid or is trying, so it was like, okay, I gotta commit all the way. But with Vivian, I think like you, I'd encountered Vivian's where I like really admire them, I'm really terrified of them. And then I think once I started learning and things that I might have at times gotten out of control and tried to be that Vivian, to like, when I was feeling a lot of anger about Asian Americans, and this, I'm sure this is like explored in your novel, who would support Peter Liang instead of a Kai girly, or they were right, like pro police, or like I would not know how to approach these sorts of conversations like online. So I would just be very angry and would just like scold them and lecture. And so I at times was like, oh, I think maybe at times I've been a Vivian. So yeah, she's a fascinating character, and I really wanted to show that in the end, like she like breaks down. She has so much that she's carrying on her own, that she's just sort of decided she needs to carry, and it sort of breaks her at the end. And but I'm glad she gets away, right? She like moves to New York. I don't think that's a spoiler or anything, but
yeah, great. So another thing I wanted to ask about with this book was there's a lot of like interesting formal experimentation. So there's a lot of text within texts. There's a whole section that is staged like a play with kind of like dialogue cues. I know we share a love for the writer Karente Yamashita, who does a lot of that kind of mixing different genres within a novel. But I'm wondering how that came into play, and there's also footnotes in the book. So yeah, I'm just wondering about your play and experimentation with the text itself, and kind of breaking the just straight kind of like realist convention of the novel.
Yeah, that was something that I didn't plan at all. So when like in the first two versions, there really weren't, I think, any sort of these, maybe like yeah, a Xiao and Chow poem, very light sort of found objects. And then I think in the third version, it just, certain things felt harder to write in prose, where I was like, this is so much work. I should just like put, instead of describing the petition or something, I'll just like put the petition in there as this madman, this like anti-China madman would write it. Okay, done. I didn't have to like sort of craft it in and everything. Or Michael's blog. So at one point during revisions, I realized like I needed to chart his ascension, how he sort of spirals and gains this following very quickly. And again, it was, I don't know if I'm lazy or something. It was like, oh, what? I was like, is this like another chapter that's going to take a lot? I know, I'll write a blog. So a lot of these decisions came as like, it made more sense for the characters to just speak themselves, right? It was, instead of trying to inhabit Michael's mind in any way or something, you're just going to read like what kind of crap he's writing on the internet. And that will give you, the reader, a sense of, how he operates and how he becomes so popular. And like the screenplay section, I think it's so, what they're talking about is so heavy, it's so intense, like it's what's sort of like off at the hinges, right? But it also some dark stuff. And I think that also would have been too hard to have that and then also weave in the traditional like setting and descriptions, and it was like I knew the dialogue was the most important, so let's just cut the others. Let's just, oh well, okay, it's sort of just like a scene like from a play or a movie. Okay, that makes sense. And it makes sense that it's like she's dreaming it, right? She's having this feverish dream, so that seemed to make sense. So yeah, a lot of it was like on the cuff, me being tired or like and just trying to problem solve, like how do I get this across, and then reaching for these other, and so by the end I was like, oh, I've amassed quite a few of these. This will seem very intentional.
Nice, it did. And the screenplay section towards the end was just a devastating passage. It was so good. Yeah, and it does that thing of like, it just cuts straight to the topic.
That's great to hear.
So, just now you mentioned the poetry in the book, Xiao Chao. So maybe briefly for our audience, would you like to describe the kind of like real life collective trauma for the Asian American community that inspired what happens in the novel?
I love how you describe it. It was, right? I feel like it really like galvanized a lot of Asian Americans. And yeah, in 2015, a white poet wrote a poem with some Chinese mythology in it, submitted it to places. It got rejected a few times. I need to double check how many times, but
it was like
regardless,
or something.
It was what?
It was like 42 or something really ridiculous.
Well, you know what? Writing is about rejection. Okay. It's like, yeah, we've all faced so much rejection. And I think instead of what writers do, which is, oh, let me put this poem away for a few months, let me workshop it, send it to beta readers. There's all these methods, right? This poet was like, clearly the problem is I'm white. And if I weren't white, I could get this published. So he submitted it to a diversity issue of an anthology, like specifically something that he would not have been able to, right, before, because it was for POC only. And it got accepted. And then he sort of gleefully and very quickly outed himself, I think, to be like, you see, the system is rigged against white men. And it was like, no, that is not the point. And you cannot do what you did. You cannot pretend to be us on paper and in your life, go about your white man ways, enjoys your white man life. Like, we are not something you can slip on and off when it benefits you. Just really, I think this, like, how did you feel, right? Like, did you feel also this outrage at like, you didn't suffer that way, we moving in an Asian body, so how dare you like now try to take it?
Yeah, I think it was that. And I think it was also just the sheer entitlement of it. Just like this sense of like, if I am not published, there's something wrong with this system, wrong with me. The idea that you can cross any sort of ethical and moral and racial boundary to do that. That was, what kind of appalled me about it.
Right. And that it just screamed a sort of white entitlement, because I think to a lot of us, it's inconceivable that we would have, right, because of how we move through the world, that it would have never occurred to us, I think, that to do something so unethical and outrageous. And yeah, I think that's how he incriminates himself, is the fact that he thought he could do this. And yeah, and unfortunately there are like so many now, very famous one was Rachel Dolezal around the same time. In academia, they like keep popping up, right? People pretend to be Native American, pretend to be Latinx. Like it's I think we haven't finished unearthing them. I'm sure there are more that are just like hiding now.
So speaking of which, Ingrid takes it upon herself to get to the root of a similar mystery in this novel. Um, and it becomes, campus satire mixed with crime caper. But yeah, I'm wondering how you developed this idea of having it really be a sort of Orientalist mystery that unfolds.
Yeah, I think originally the novel, when I was conceiving it, it didn't have that plot line at all. Like it was going to be Ingrid's very problematic relationship with white men, where she, um, without questioning why, she just only gravitated towards white men and wanted to justify that. And then as she gets older, realizes the true reasoning behind that and feels very disgusted by herself and any attraction she feels to white men. So that was the original novel. Was like, yeah, very serious. There was a sexual assault case on the campus, like where she was a professor. And then I read about the collective trauma of 2015 that Jenny Zhang wrote about so powerfully in BuzzFeed. That article is radicalizing. When I think about it now, and the times I've referenced it, I'm like, oh yeah, that I think that radical definitely had a part. But once I thought of that and I was like, oh, I must write about this, right? It was like, okay, well, Ingrid's a professor and she's researching. And so, it would make sense that she's researching this poet. And so I sort of thought of this other storyline and combined them. And I think just me personally as a reader, like I love a mystery. I just I love a caper. And I think getting to write that where she uncovers it was just very fun for me as someone who just enjoys that type of story and mystery. And I guess I realized that it would make sense that a lot of her self-discovery has to be, there has to be something that kickstarts it, right? And I was like, what would be so horrific where this woman who's just very happily, right, like with a white man, and that's that, and she's not questioning it, like what would kick her out of that status quo life? And it had to be something horrifying. So I wanted her to like actually see it up close.
Yeah, great. And so you were mentioning, kind of the kernel of the novel being this problematic relationship between Ingrid and a white fiance or husband. And so to me, another thing that really struck me about this novel was that you kind of go to what I would say is a third rail of Asian American literature, which is exactly that. I was reflecting earlier, I was looking at my bookcase, and I think probably the majority of Asian American novels feature romance between white and Asian protagonists or main characters, but very few of them do a deep interrogation of the racial politics of that. Except in the most kind of like general cultural way, but not in terms of like race as a historical social construct. And it gets uncomfortable in this book. This book is like not easy to read in that way, and gets to some really, really needed places. So yeah, I guess I'm just wondering how you knew that was where you wanted to, this was the territory for this novel, and what it was like to just dive in and really get into those questions.
Yeah. When they say writing is like a way to work out your own issue. Am I admitting too much? It's like, I think it is upset because I realized I was talking with some like writer friends, like, oh, they say writers tend to have like a couple obsessions that they write about for the rest of their lives, and like every novel they write is some iteration of that. And I was thinking about like short stories I've written, and I was like, oh my god, this is definitely an obsession of mine. And I think that some of the sadness and anger I feel towards young Elaine is because I wasn't learning or seeing or reading this kind of relationship, right? Up close and like in like really diving into it. Do you remember in 2005 this YouTube video by Wong Fu Productions called Yellow Fever like burst onto the scene? Do you remember this at all? Okay,
I haven't seen that one.
It was when like YouTube was like baby YouTube, but it like shook my campus because I went to UC Irvine, which is at that time it was 60% Asian, and we were all just like, oh, this phenomenon like has a name, right? And then we were talking about it, but it was, even in that video, it was funny, it was a joke, it was not seen as dehumanization, it was not seen as objectification, it was just like ha ha ha, like there's a lot of white guys who like Asian girls, and there seem to be a lot of Asian girls who like white guys, and here they are on campus, see them walking around everywhere. and that was sort of it. And yeah, it's that sort of, cheesy aphorism of like you write the thing you wish you could have read. And I needed for myself to write this, but I also needed to read it, and I wish I had, just because it affected my life. It really affected my life, right? I think being fetishized fucks you up. And it takes a lot of time to sort of try to unpiece feelings you had in a relationship, where then you realize, you step back and you're like, oh, I was an object. So what did those feelings mean, right? Were they real? Were they, and what does that say about me? And if I knew and I stayed, or if I try to talk myself out of that, I didn't really know, or what, I think it's so many, not just Asian women, but people, because this is definitely, I think it's like kind of skyrocketing the K-dramas is what I've heard from Asian men, that just like some white women are just like jumping on them and like only want a Korean, boyfriend now, which is, yeah. But so I think just Asian people in general, so many have told me, yeah, it fucked them up, and it was a really big part of their lives, but it was something we would just sort of whisper about, and maybe if you saw like a slight nod to it, yeah, and like media or something, it was often treated as a joke. And I was like, this isn't a joke. And I think there are real consequences behind seeing a human being as a set of traits, reducing us down to these replaceable parts. And then that changes like how you see these people, where they I think it's easier to hurt us when we're not fully human. So I was like, this is a life and death question. It is not being treated as a life and death question. And I was like, I'm going to work out my issues. And I said too much, right?
Oh, that. I mean, I really want to just like appreciate and thank you for having that difficult conversation in this novel. And I feel being part of this current moment of taking it seriously. And if anything, the anti-Asian violence, the killings of Asian women in the last years have brought that home. So yeah, it's critical. And on that same topic, so the passage you read is about Stephen, Ingrid's relationship to Stephen. Stephen, to me, might be one of the great villains in contemporary literature because, well, here's what's amazing to me about their relationship is that it's messy. It's not that he's such a villain that there's no affection or care. I think on some level, Stephen probably believes he is doing the best he can. He was expressing love the way he knows how, and also refuses to interrogate or be open to looking at that in really, really harmful ways. So yeah, anything you want to say about Stephen, about this kind of new version of like soft boy masculinity, soft boy white masculinity? Yeah, I'd be curious.
Yes, you hit it on the head. Yeah. The software, I was fascinated by the soft boy that, and one of them, I don't know if you heard about this, in a few years ago, was like terrorizing Asian women at Yale. He was like a Yale undergrad, where he would like message on Tinder, exclusively Asian women with, I just want to write poetry, come and die. You want to be involved in any of those processes? And would like play his guitar on the first date and would write these really, like vulnerable poems and letters and talk about like, oh, I was bullied as a kid and I have trauma. And so these women would like open up to him and be like, oh my God, he's so sensitive. And then when he was outed, what was incredible was there was this one Instagram account that was outing him. And there were tons of screenshots of other Asian women being like, he did the same fucking thing to me. And he wrote me a poem on our second date. And then he played me the sad guitar song. And I was like, this man is so villainous, because he found a way in, right? He's like, I'm not going to be that like bro or jock that's just like, oh, I have a thing for Asian girls. Like, you want to be my first or something, where he is smart enough to know like Asian women, a lot of Asian women now are going to be like, fuck you, I'm running away. But if he's like not bringing up anything about Asia and is just like, I'm a feminist, I'm like sensitive, but just targets Asian women, it's so insidious, right? And I think writing Stephen's character, I wanted him to be insidious, in that we approach him in the beginning as like, oh, he's so like soft and just plain. And, Ingrid had really shitty boyfriend. And we think of Stephen as like the nice guy, right? And I think absolutely, like what you said, I wanted to show abuse and manipulation comes in all shapes and sizes. And it's not what we stereotypically might think of, but that in a lot of ways, because of these stereotypes and ideas we have about how abuse manifests, that often we overlook this new wave of, I think men like Stephen are very smart. and at the end, he like becomes like an anti-Asian, anti-hate crime agent, right? Anyways, he becomes this activist like for the Asian community, and then like inserts himself into that scene and gets his now, what is it, number 5, like his Japanese, ultimate goal, like the Japanese girlfriend. And I'm like, yeah, because I've seen them, and I've seen them adapt. And the smart ones know where the conversation's changing, how it's changing, so they adapt. And God, makes me so happy you said that, because about him being this villain, because I think these men walk amongst us all the time, everywhere, and I think they get a pass, and they have a million excuses, just like Stephen did, right? It's a preference. You should take it as a compliment, whatever. And I think they are actively doing harm to us and exposing us to abusive situations, and they get away with it every day. Yeah. So this was like my turn. It was like my chance to put him on the page and show how horrible he is.
Yeah. To paraphrase the famous saying, writing well is the best revenge.
I'd forgotten that one. I remember that one, Ryan. Yes.
Writing well is the best revenge, but I think this is it. So I have one more question. I see there are a couple of Q&As already from the audience. Everyone out there, please get your questions ready. But yeah, so going into this deep stuff around the Stephen type going into fetishization. You wrote this really amazing and devastating piece in The Cut recently, which I highly recommend everyone out there read. Google it. I guess my question is, when you're looking at this really toxic, intense stuff, how do you work with it emotionally and mentally? Like, how do you care for yourself? How do you care for that material? Yeah.
Aw, thank you for that, because I feel like that's a question rooted in care for each other, and that means a lot to me, Ryan. Oh, thank you, John. I just saw you linked it. It was, God, that piece, I wrote it a lot of times with like tears streaming down my face. When the first time, the first iteration, I had to be so distant from it. I barely said anything at all. And all it was 18 pages of quotations from these horrifying forums and blogs that get progressively like worse. Honestly, I just think about, like, I cut out so much. There's so much bad stuff, but I put in maybe like 3 quotes. It's like, you don't even have the idea of what they say and how many of them say this about us. But it was like the quotations and then a murder summary. Quotation, murder summary, quotation, and it was like 18 pages. I was so unwell, Ryan. I was very unwell for like a while. I would like flinch. Like I felt sick. I felt, but I also just had so much heartbreak for like what those women went through, and felt, I don't know if this is wise at all, but that was like, I must show what they, that must document their pain. Like, if I have discovered this, is my responsibility. But like, I actually like sent it out to a few places, and everyone was horrified, and every editor was like, no. Which I understand why now, but like, that's how distant I had to be from it, where I couldn't even really engage with the ideas or myself. And then it was like, after the Atlanta shootings last year, I realized like, oh, I had shit to say. And just like one night I was just very angry and emotional and was just like banging things out. But if it felt like too hard to even touch, and it just sort of sat there. And then I started working on it again last fall. And then when Christina Unili died, that was when I wrote, no one has ever looked at me with fear. Like, sometimes I want to buy a gun. Because I was just, that night, I was so fucking fed up, and was just like, when you feel so impotent at a certain point, violence, that's how ground down we are, right? That violence seems like a viable solution. And you think about when the Black Panthers armed themselves, it was precisely like, 400 years of this has got to stop. You've been ticking us off. This is an extinction. So like, instead of calling it violence, this is protection, this is defense. And anyways, that's going to open up a whole can of worms. I'm not saying I'm like pro Second Amendment at all. I would like to abolish the Second Amendment, but that's how messed up I was, right? That fight or flight instincts kick in, and that's how they start making us think. So yeah, man, it was really hard. And I think I probably like never want to write an essay. And I think the only way I could write the novel which deals with a lot of triggering things, but if I could make myself laugh, it didn't hurt as much, right? So I think that was the only way. I think writing an essay straight, when you are facing yourself head on and you're facing, it's terrifying. And it's, I have a lot of respect for nonfiction writers, because just having it done once, I'm like, well, I think that was good. I think maybe I'll stop there. But yeah, I really appreciate you asking about that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for writing that. Thank you for writing this novel. And yeah, here's to humor as survival. John, I think we're going to open it up. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank you, Elaine, for reading. Thank you, Ryan, for leading an incredible conversation. We just have 2 questions so far. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A. I'll try to get to them before we wrap up here in about 10 minutes. Our first question, Marva writes, I loved hearing you describe the ways you relate or have related to Ingrid and Vivian. I'm wondering if there are other characters you relate to. Also, if this is too personal, feel free to skip.
Oh, that was a nice like disclaimer. Yeah, I think that a few people have mentioned there's the trifecta of Asian women, like the main Asian women characters are Eunice, Ingrid, Vivian. Yeah, we should talk about Eunice because a lot of people that I talk to and I'm like, oh, who is your favorite character? Or who do you want to like, people telling they want to be friends with? It's always Eunice because I think she brings so much lightness and much needed joy and comfort, I think, to Ingrid. And she didn't exist in the first 2 versions of the novel. And Ingrid was honestly just going through all this stuff alone. And now I'm like, how could I have done that to her? Everyone needs a Eunice. And I feel like Eunice is, I think on a superficial level, it was my homage to the Asian baby girl that was like prominent in, I don't know, it was like the early 2000s that I definitely for a while aspired to be like in ABG, and went to college with like ABGs. And I just sort of, what I love about Eunice and what I think when I think back to those years of like the ABG and like AZN guys with like, right, they're like lowered Honda Accords and and yeah, and how we would dress. Yeah, I think with such fun is that it was so special in that it was this subset of the Asian American community where a lot of them like just didn't have any white friends and truly like zero interest in kind of like making white friends or like white culture. And really it was like their own culture of like, yeah, like, we party hard and then we like get pho at 3 a.m. and then we get boba, obviously. And it's yeah, I think thinking about it now, I'm like, that is really beautiful and special. And I wanted Eunice to honor that. And I think I relate to her in that yeah, the part of me that I think is just like, yeah, wants to have fun. that sees fun as something, as a valuable thing that we need, right, in our community, and to be able to go on every day. And Eunice, I think, is a reminder of like, yeah, life is hard, so you know what, let's have some fun.
A viewer writes, you mentioned Jenny Zhang's article being an influence for Disorientation. Did you have any other literary influences?
Yes, definitely. So I think one book that influenced me a lot was Don Lee's Yellow. And I feel like Yellow is like required reading for Asian American lit, and it should be. And it was, I think, the first book I read where it wasn't like a Chinese American family saga, a Korean American family saga, or a Japanese. It was like all of us. And it wasn't really about so much family. It was just like different Asian Americans, like Vietnamese, Korean, Chinese, like all hanging out and like sleeping with each other and fighting with each other. And I think it was really important for me to read in that it was like, oh wait, this is what my life looks like, right? My life is not actually segregated in like, I only know other Taiwanese Americans or something. Like it's us together. And so that was a big influence. Revenge of the Mooncake Vixen by Marilyn Chin I highly recommend. It is a delightful, weird little book. And it uses like magical realism or speculative parts where like one of the girls, she wishes, there's these 2 twins and one of them wishes for round eyes, and like one day she just wakes up with them. And it's sort of meta, and the authors, it's very playful and has that sort of self-knowledge that I think was I hadn't read before. These sort of two very messy Asian American girl characters. They're sort of like just unapologetically messy. And I've talked about before, like Paul Beatty's The Sellout. I think reading a satire that so clearly was written not to be universally understood, was just like badass, and I was like, oh, one can do this. Like, it was a lot of moments for me to be just, I had to read these things to even understand they could be done. And I don't think, like, this was not in lit classes, this was not in definitely in the American public education system. Like, I feel like these texts I had to like seek out on my own to know they existed and were possible.
Thank you. And we just had one more question, asking what the BuzzFeed article you mentioned was. I believe it was they pretend to be us while pretending we don't exist. Is that the Jenny Yang? Okay, great.
Exactly. Yes.
I'm gonna put that in the chat as well.
Oh yes, that's another required reading for sure.
But we've reached the top of the hour. And so, yeah, that article is in the chat now, as is Elaine's article in The Cut, What White Men Say in Our Absence. And of course, links to purchase Disorientation are in the chat as well. And you can find all those links in the description below me if you're watching on YouTube. Elaine Hsieh Chou, Ryan Lee Wong, thank you both so much for joining us on At Home with Literati. Elaine, congrats again on the publication of Disorientation. Hope to have you both in the store for an actual reading, in-store reading. This was an actual reading, but an actual in-store reading in the not too distant future. But until then, I hope you both continue to stay safe and be well. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us at Home with Literati, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Congratulations, Elaine.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, John, and everyone. This was so special. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a great night.